It is the winter of 1944, and somewhere along the frozen Belgian frontier, a German infantryman presses himself into a mud-caked foxhole and pulls his greatcoat tighter against the biting cold. He has survived 2 years on the Eastern Front. He has endured artillery barrages that turned the sky into a wall of fire. He has watched men die in ways he cannot bring himself to describe in letters home. He is not, by any reasonable measure, a man who frightens easily. And then he hears it, drifting through the dark and frozen air, carried on the wind like something half-remembered from childhood, comes a melody. It is soft at first, almost imperceptible beneath the distant rumble of artillery. But it grows. A woman's voice, warm and impossibly gentle, singing a German lullaby. The kind of song his mother might have hummed whilst tucking him into bed in Hamburg or Dresden or some small village in Bavaria whose name he hasn't allowed himself to think about in months. Lily Marlene, the song of sweethearts and lamplight and a world that no longer exists. He begins to weep. Within 20 minutes, he and 11 of his comrades have crawled out of their positions with their hands raised. This is not a scene from a novel. This is not dramatic embellishment. This is the documented operational reality of one of the most peculiar, audacious, and quietly devastating psychological warfare programs the British military ever devised. A campaign so understated in its methods and so extraordinary in its results that it has been largely overlooked by mainstream histories of the Second World War. How did the British military weaponize a lullaby? Why did it work so devastatingly well? And why have so few people heard this story? The answer begins, as so many strange British wartime innovations do, not in a gleaming laboratory or a grand military headquarters, but in a drafty, requisitioned country house somewhere in the English countryside, staffed by an unlikely collection of academics, broadcasters, musicians, and what one contemporary account cheerfully described as persons of dubious but useful talent. To understand why the British turned to music as a weapon of war, you must first understand the problem they were trying to solve. By 1942, the Allied campaign to erode German military morale through conventional means had reached something of an impasse. Strategic bombing, whilst devastating in material terms, was proving a blunt instrument when it came to breaking the will of individual soldiers. Leaflet drops, millions of printed pages tumbling from aircraft over enemy lines, were largely ineffective. German troops had been thoroughly indoctrinated against Allied propaganda. Many used the leaflets for rather more practical purposes without reading a word. Standard radio broadcasts in German, beamed from BBC transmitters, were being jammed with increasing efficiency by the Wehrmacht's signals corps. What was needed was something that could not be jammed, something that bypassed the rational, indoctrinated mind and reached directly into the emotional core of the man holding the rifle, something that reminded a soldier with visceral and irresistible force that he was not a cog in the National Socialist war machine. He was a son, a husband, a father, a boy who had once been afraid of the dark and had been comforted by a voice he loved. The men tasked with finding that something were gathered under the auspices of a unit that went by the deliberately mundane designation of the Political Warfare Executive, or PWE, established in August 1941 and headquartered at Woburn Abbey in Bedfordshire. A rather magnificent setting for an organisation whose job was psychological subversion. The PWE brought together an extraordinary range of talent. Sefton Delmer, a former Daily Express journalist who spoke flawless German and possessed what colleagues described as a criminal understanding of human weakness, led much of the operational work. Alongside him, were professional musicians, sound engineers recruited from the BBC, German émigrés, who understood with painful intimacy exactly what would cut through the armor of a homesick Wehrmacht soldier, and a small team of specialists in what was then called, with characteristic British understatement, black broadcasting. The technical innovation that made the Lullaby program possible was the mobile loudspeaker unit. And this is where the story takes a turn that is simultaneously mundane and remarkable. The British Army had been experimenting since 1940 with vehicle-mounted public address systems capable of projecting sound over considerable distances. By 1943, these had evolved into units of genuine operational sophistication. The core equipment consisted of high-powered amplifiers, producing outputs of between 500 and 1,000 watts, roughly equivalent in raw acoustic terms to a small professional concert venue. Mounted on modified lorries or half-tracks and connected to directional horn speakers that could focus sound across distances of up to 1 kilometer, roughly 2/3 of a mile, under favorable conditions. The horns themselves were engineering achievements worth noting. Constructed from aluminium and steel, each unit weighed in the region of 80 to 120 kilograms and was precisely angled to project sound in a relatively tight beam, minimizing the acoustic signature for the operators whilst maximizing impact at the target position. The system ran from the vehicle's own power generation, meaning it required no external infrastructure and could be positioned, operated for several hours, and withdrawn without leaving any permanent trace of its presence. The recordings, and this is the detail that separates the Lullaby program from straightforward battlefield loudspeaker use, were produced at facilities connected to the PWE's broadcasting operations and represented months of careful psychological research. The music was not simply German, it was specifically German in the way that homesickness is specifically personal. The team selected songs that were regional, folk melodies from Saxony or Bavaria or the Rhineland, lullabies that carried the particular emotional texture of specific places rather than generalized national sentiment. The female vocalists were chosen for voices that had a particular quality the PWE's psychological advisors described in their internal documentation as maternal warmth combined with an absence of obvious propaganda intent. The recordings deliberately avoided any political content whatsoever. No calls to surrender, no denunciations of Hitler, no promises of Allied treatment for prisoners of war. Just a woman's voice, just a song, just a sound that reached back through years of war and ideology and survival mode brutality to touch something that propaganda cannot manufacture and the Wehrmacht could not train out of its men, the simple, devastating memory of being loved. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The operational deployment of these units is where the documented record becomes, necessarily, somewhat patchy. Much of the PWE's operational detail remained classified for decades, and some files have never been fully released. What we can say with confidence is that mobile loudspeaker units operating alongside the PWE's psychological warfare program were used in the Italian campaign from late 1943, in the advance through France and the Low Countries following D-Day, and in operations along the German frontier through the winter of 1944 and into 1945. Accounts from Allied soldiers who witnessed the broadcasts describe an atmosphere of almost surreal incongruity. The apocalyptic machinery of modern warfare suddenly stilled, replaced by the sound of a woman singing softly in German, while snow fell on broken trees and ruined farmhouses. Several veterans recalled the effect as deeply unsettling even for those who could not understand the words. Something about the sheer gentleness of the sound against its context that stripped away the psychological scaffolding of military existence. German accounts gathered from prisoner interrogations conducted by Allied intelligence units document a consistent pattern of response. Soldiers described feeling suddenly and overwhelmingly aware of how long they had been away from home. Several accounts mention weeping uncontrollably. A significant number described the experience as breaking something in them that they had not realized was still intact. Some last connection between the man they had been before the war and the soldier the war had made them. The Germans, for their part, attempted to develop comparable systems, and it is instructive to compare the two approaches. The Wehrmacht had employed loudspeaker propaganda since the early campaigns of 1939 and 1940, but their methodology was characteristically direct. Announcements in the enemy's language, factual statements about military positions, calls to surrender delivered with Teutonic precision. The psychological approach was blunt. Tell the enemy soldier he is surrounded, that his position is hopeless, that resistance is futile. This worked, after a fashion, in situations where those statements were demonstrably true. What the German approach almost entirely lacked was the emotional obliqueness that made the British program so effective. The British were not telling soldiers anything. They were making them feel something specific, personal, and impossible to argue against. You cannot respond rationally to a lullaby. You cannot dismiss it as enemy propaganda. It does not present a claim to be refuted. It simply reaches inside you and reminds you of everything you have lost and everything you are afraid you will never see again. The Americans developed their own loudspeaker units through the Office of War Information, and these were technically comparable to the British equipment in terms of power output and range. The American approach tended toward direct communication, news of Allied advances, surrender procedures, appeals to reason and self-preservation. These were not without value, and American psychological warfare operations produced genuine results, particularly in the Pacific Theatre. But the emotional sophistication of the British lullaby program remained, by most assessments, distinctly singular. It was an approach that could only have emerged from a particular combination of influences: the BBC's deep understanding of voice and atmosphere, the German émigrés' insider knowledge of their homeland's emotional landscape, and a very British talent for achieving maximum effect through apparent minimalism. The legacy of the lullaby program extends in several directions that repay attention. In the immediate post-war period, the techniques developed by the PWE, and particularly the insight that emotional resonance is more powerful than rational argument as a tool of psychological influence, were absorbed into the doctrine of both British and American psychological operations units that persisted through the Cold War. The principle that effective psychological warfare reaches not the mind but the heart, not the soldier's tactical calculation but his human vulnerability, became foundational to modern PSYOP theory in ways that the men singing into horn speakers across the Belgian winter could not have anticipated. There is also something worth sitting with in the broader historical meaning of what the British achieved, in a war defined by industrial-scale violence, by the systematic application of technology to the business of killing at unprecedented efficiency. A group of broadcasters and musicians and academics in a requisitioned country house discovered that the most effective weapon they could deploy against a heavily armed, ideologically hardened enemy soldier was a song, not a complicated song, not a technically sophisticated song, a lullaby. Surviving examples of the mobile loudspeaker equipment from this period can be found in the collection of the Imperial War Museum in London, which holds examples of PWE documentation alongside examples of the technical hardware. The recordings themselves, those carefully engineered, psychologically calibrated pieces of maternal comfort, produced to break the will of men who had survived years of industrialized slaughter, exist in archive collections, though access to the complete operational library remains restricted in some cases. Return now to that Belgian foxhole, to the soldier in his mud-caked greatcoat pressing himself into the frozen earth. He has endured what most human beings could not imagine enduring. He has been hardened by the Eastern Front, shaped by ideology, sustained by the particular brutal momentum that keeps men fighting long after every rational reason to continue has been exhausted. And then a woman sings to him, not about the war, not about surrender, not about the hopelessness of his position or the certainty of Allied victory. She sings about lamplight and sweethearts and the particular quality of safety that only exists in the memory of childhood. She sings about a world he had almost managed to forget he once inhabited. The British military, in its peculiar, oblique, magnificently understated way, had discovered something that no amount of bombing or leafleting or jamming could have revealed. That inside every soldier, no matter how long the war has lasted, no matter how thoroughly the man has been replaced by the soldier, there is still a child who remembers being put to bed by someone who loved him. And that child will always, eventually, put down his rifle. The Germans had tanks and discipline and the finest military engineering on earth. The British had a woman's voice and a song about a lamplight. It turns out that the song was heavier.